All right, should be recording. So the purpose of this meeting is to talk about this pipeline issues we have, or the issue that we have for triggering pipelines when another project is rebuilt. And there's been some confusion around what we're building. I think that everybody understands the issue. And just the question is whether we are building it in an extensible way or not, and if it's worth it. It seems to be like what the conversation is coming down to. So just to summarize the issue, anybody who is watching this video later and doesn't have the link, it's GitLab EE issue 9045, triggering a pipeline when another project is rebuilt, as I mentioned. And the basic functionality of the feature is that you can configure in project B that it cares about project A. And whenever project A completes successfully, optionally on a branch, on a specific branch like master, then you want your pipeline to start. And the scenario where you would do that is if project A is a library you depend on, or it has like a microservice definition that you need to process, or it generates some data that you need to then do something with. You can just say that, I want to trigger my project when the other one runs. The only way to do this in the product today is in project A, you can use the triggered keyword and say, go ahead and start B. And that does work for some use cases, but there's a lot of cases at big companies or in open source projects where project A doesn't know about you or want to maintain a list of everything that's dependent on it. So it's better from their perspective if the clients, so B in this case, can just say, I'm dependent on it, so trigger me when that's run. I don't have to coordinate anything with that team, and that's it. So the original way that we were going to build this was there would be a top-level needs keyword that would just let you specify the project and branch that are relevant that would then trigger the pipeline. But the way that it looks like it's being implemented is that there's a job inside of pipeline B that somehow connects back to the global status of project A. And so the first thing that I was confused over is if there's a job in pipeline B that triggers pipeline B, it's like a chicken and egg problem where you need the job to be running in order to know that it needs to trigger itself existing. But maybe that's like an implementation detail, but it does seem kind of strange that it would be a specific job within the pipeline that's responsible for triggering the pipeline that contains itself. And then the other thing we were just talking about was, is it, there's some, I guess, extensibility benefits to doing it in a more general way where, like in the future, the pipelines could be running at the same time or different status attributions could be available. And is any of that necessary? Does everything I've said so far make sense and sound correct?
Cases, except that I'm not really able to understand what you mean by pipeline B having a job that triggers pipeline B. Like it sounds like a circular dependency.
Exactly, yeah. I'm still confused by that one.
And that's what I don't really understand. Why would we ever need to have a pre-job or the job that depends on the same pipeline it's running in?
I agree, but that's what the issue says we're building.
Really, I'm not really sure. Camille, do you recall why we would ever need to have a circular dependency? I think that's the first time I'm hearing about this.
Circular dependency of what?
So Jason, can you point me to the description?
Yeah, I'll share a link to where that's like explicitly. But basically, the needs keyword is inside of a job within the pipeline that's triggered.
whenever we create that pipeline, that's that's the moment we subscribe to the upstream pipeline, right? So how otherwise would you, at which point would you create the subscription, the relationship between the pipeline A and pipeline B, or actually pipeline B to pipeline A?
Well, for this particular issue, there doesn't need to be any, because that pipeline A is always finished successfully.
I mean, that's not what I'm asking about. So in order to set up relationship and subscription, let's call it subscription, okay? Let's use the single language
Yep.
to refer to all the things we are talking about. So in order to set up a subscription, you need to do that at some point, right? So currently we are doing that whenever someone modifies GitLab CI YAML and pushes a new configuration. And the most simple way to actually create the subscription is when the pipeline gets created and we evaluate all of the jobs we have there, right? If we had the top level configuration, it would behave the same way because someone modifies GitLab CI YAML and pushes it to the repository. We create the pipeline, and that's the moment where we create a subscription. Does it make sense, Jason?
Not really.
Yeah, it's complex. It's just a very complex issue. There's a lot of essential complexity here. How can we?
So maybe this would help for me to understand. The other way that you could build this feature, and maybe it's a bad idea, but just like from a kind of like understanding perspective, humor me. The other way you could do this is have some kind of event in the system. That's when a pipeline finishes, then things could happen. And it could subscribe to that event. Like when basically a pipeline success event that it could subscribe to. That seems way simpler. And there may be good reasons why you wouldn't ever do it in that way, but.
Yeah, but that's the second step. The first step is to tell GitLab about the relationship between pipeline B to pipeline A, right?
Yeah.
That's the first step. And we do that in the GitLab CI YAML.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't matter if it's a top level configuration or it's defined inside the job. We push a new GitLab CI YAML, and when the pipeline gets created, it's the moment when we define the relationship. Does it make sense?
When the pipeline is created, then the relationship is defined.
Yeah, the relationship is defined. That's the moment.
Before then, though, because it's because the pipeline can't exist before knowing if it needs to be triggered.
But we are talking about the downstream pipeline, not the upstream pipeline, right?
Yeah.
I think that could be that I don't know if that's correct, but could be that we are using the wrong tool to define the subscription, because maybe the GitLab CI YAML is runtime configurations. So it means we have to run a pipeline beforehand before discovering that that pipeline wants to subscribe to something else. That might cause a pipeline, the downstream pipeline, to start and wait there forever until eventually some events happen in the upstream pipeline. So I think what we are trying to do is to create a subscription, which is more some sort of project level settings that I want to say when something event that happened in a different pipeline, then always trigger a pipeline in this project. Maybe you can then define with some rules. Maybe possibly another idea would be that when every time we changes to GitLab CI YAML, we evaluate the subscription and we somehow save that as a configuration for a project. So that will always run, will always be some created. It doesn't need to be evaluated, or we don't need to start a pipeline.
Yeah, maybe that's better also, because then you don't have this problem with every branch having, like a different version of this file and trying to figure out what all these different subscriptions mean.
Yeah, but the only downside of this, I think, is the fact that then we are mixing some project configuration with runtime pipeline configurations in the same file, and that might not be clear That's what I think one of the downside might consider.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea, but then it means you would need to create a completely different code for handling pushing GitLab CI without actually creating a pipeline. So in a way that we can detect that a commit contains a new version of GitLab CI YAML, and we just process it to persist some configuration without actually creating a pipeline. So that's really difficult and probably more complex than what we are doing right now. And the iteration that Kamil proposed to actually make it useful for the pipeline that is going to be created, like it's a very interesting iteration in my opinion.
So actually, let me challenge like these like different approaches, because it seems that there are like different approaches to this solution, and that they imply slightly different outcomes and what we can actually achieve. So actually, Jason, you posted this this like message showing two different syntaxes, right?
Yeah.
Let me open some new terminal. So basically, like we have these two different syntaxes, which is like top level needs versus job level needs. And let me. So actually, I think that like the best way for like starting looking at these approaches is like thinking. The question that Gregos you had, like when we trigger the downstream pipeline. So like how we preserve this data for the triggering and on what conditions. So like how we track where to trigger downstream pipeline and for what branches, tags we track to trigger downstream pipeline. Because like in whatever solution we choose, whether this is like top level needs or like job level needs, we need to have a solution that can work on the scale. So that can like, because like we're not gonna iterate every project for every pipeline finish to figure out whether this project has configuration to like to trigger downstream pipeline. So we have to like have some constraints that define that on these particular cases, we evaluate these like needs conditions, and we maybe trigger this pipeline because of these needs conditions. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. But one thing, yeah, go ahead.
So like one way of confining that, like, is like what you Fabio proposed, like to solve that. There is like two different ways to solve that. Like one is like building interface for that, like having UI with associated database model. This is basically like the that is just creates what you Grzegorz said, like pipeline. Actually, it's not really pipeline. It's like project A is connected with project B, maybe on this branch, maybe on some other conditions. I don't know, variable, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the cases. But like, what happens if we have this configuration part as part of the GitLab CI YAML? We basically have the GitLab CI YAML on every commit, on every branch, on every tag. We cannot really track like every branch. I don't think so. Like we're not gonna trigger like 1,000.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Is if you've got like in our www GitLab project, if they're all dependent on some library and we have 1,000 branches, then if it's in the GitLab CI YAML, it's going to trigger 1,000 builds.
Yeah, so like we're not gonna do that, and likely it seems that like the best like cut there, it's like we maybe just gonna track only for master. So maybe like we create associated database model when we analyze GitLab CI YAML on master. I think it's regardless if it's like part of the create pipeline service or it's not. Maybe we just update this relation when you push to the master, which means that like we have a new configuration. And just because like we have this config changes additive, as soon as we start pushing these changes, we could start tracking these changes in the database. So there is like continuity. So it kind of JSON solves your chicken egg problem, because there is no chicken egg problem, because the first you start like creating this pipeline, the trigger on the upstream project cannot happen before you push the CI YAML to the downstream project. When you push to the downstream project, we just gonna create this relation, and then when upstream project triggers again, it would trigger the downstream project, because you would have that relation already created. So yeah. It's more like the ordering of the operations that happens, right?
Yeah, it just seems, yeah, I get it. If we make it so that kind of the master GitLab CI YAML is special and the configuration comes from there and only from there, then it sort of works. But people will want to trigger relationships between different branches.
Yes, and the question is really like how we can support relationship between different branches on the same project that is not master.
One idea was using only except in the bridge jobs.
Another potential way you could do it would be to still treat the master GitLab CI YAML as the reference, but require a syntax that maps branch to branch in the master GitLab CI YAML. But that's kind of ugly too.
Because like the problem about upstream triggers for different branches, it's like it's infinitely computational expensive, pretty much. Like it just doesn't scale. Maybe it runs on the small scale system, but like how we can support that on the GitLab.com, and like what are like the how the system is gonna behave. Because like one thing that like we have to avoid, let's say that like we have this very popular library, right? Like let's say that we have GitLab.com host race, and let's say that like we have like 1 million of the projects on 10 million of the branches, depending on this race dependency, because it's very popular. So like we have our GitLab org, GitLab CE, GitLab CI YAML having some kind of like needs. And actually needs keyword, it's very interesting about the semantics, but I'm gonna get to that in a few moments. So let's say that like we have like these million projects on like 10 million branches, because we have, let's say, 10 branches per this project, that all of that depends on the project race. And we depend on the project race because we always want to automatically bump our project to use the latest race version automatically, and we want to do it like by retesting the whole our application when the race project gets updated. So this is one of the usage of the upstream and downstream dependencies, and like in the big ecosystem of the GitLab.com, it makes it really convenient that like you have maybe some open source libraries provider, but then you have maybe private consumers of these libraries, and we want to have as much automation as possible to update always to the latest version. And basically, like how it would work in this case, because this would be like one of the patterns that people would be using. Is it something that like we build only for like private, or like private maybe to 10 and other projects? Or is it really like unlimited? So like unlimited in terms like everyone can trigger everyone, and then everyone can trigger everyone's kind of also creating like the hierarchy of like the triggers, creating really like cascades, multiplication factor of the amount of the created pipelines. I'm going to tangential point, but like it kind of like, I guess, defines exactly how this feature should work, because we have to design that to work on the GitLab.com scale. Yeah. And we have to build the confinement that would have this case that like we have a public project that is being consumed by a number of the private projects or other public projects that may be triggered, and it's gonna happen with the current syntax because there is no limitation in this behavior. Okay, so this is more maybe like a point. How we support a very popular public library that is consumed by, let's say, like of example would be race consumed by GitLab race, and like the desire is like we consume because we want to automatically update to latest version after running test suite. So this would be like one of the reasons, and probably this is likely the most of the reasons why we want to have these downstream upstream dependencies, because like one of the usage for me for downstream and upstream dependencies is like you have maybe like this set of the dependencies, which is like you have like one project, this is API backend, second project maybe this is like payment backend. So let's say that they are separate. Let's say user backend, user API backend, payment API backend. The third would be like backend for frontend, and the fourth project would be frontend. So like each of these projects depend on each other, and they basically, if we would define like the relation, it could be something like that. So project 3 depends on the project 1 and project 2. When project 4 depends on the project 3. So basically we depend on the front end depends on the backend, but backend depends on like on 2 sets of the APIs. And after that, maybe like let's say that these are like separate projects. Project A, project B, project C, project D, and let's say that on top of that we have like 5 project E, which is performing deployment to staging server as soon as project C and D is built, because we want to have also continuous deployment. We would also use upstream downstream dependencies to perform this kind of like deployments, because then like if you have downstream dependencies, it's all about like how you define the relationship, because you can have multiple projects E that can perform like deployments to different types of the environments without requiring you to define that as part of the project D, the front end. So like you may have like multiple separate repositories for that performs deployment for different types of the servers based on the different conditions when you want to deploy. For example, let's say that if you push a tag to the project D, we're just gonna perform a deployment on some other project, which is built as a upstream, as a dependency from this project to this upstream project based on the tag, the new tag that is being pushed. And we're just gonna perform like semi-automated, maybe canary deployment to the environment. But on the staging deployment, we always gonna use, for example, like master of the project, because this is something that we want to do. And another use case of that, like it just always, let's say that maybe it's being triggered from the bottom. You push a new version of the project A, the new API backend, and it triggers project C. Reruns all the tests against a new backend, and it triggers project D. Reruns all the tests on the new backend, and maybe like you have another project that performs like this kind of review apps deployment, because your application is more complex than like what you can put in very like single repo. So this is another use of the upstream downstream dependencies. That like, I mean, basically like downstream dependencies that you may use.
Actually, you can build all of this and make all this work today by using the trigger keyword, but you have to define it from the source project.
So yes, you have to define it on the upstream project. So
Yeah.
like upstream project needs to know about all the downstream projects that it uses, which is
the heart of this issue is just doing the same thing, but
reverse.
in reverse. Yeah.
So let's say like you have basically like project E to like Z that is consuming the like project C and project D because this is what you are deploying, for example. And about the different approaches, I think because like we have these two different approaches here, which is like the question is whether this is actually like a very simple triggering mechanism, or whether this is like mechanism that builds you a dependency graph. Because like let's consider like two examples of the syntax. Needs. I think that we started using needs in the context of the direct acyclic graph. So it kind of tells you that you depend on some other project, but is it really like a dependency on another project? Or is it just like a trigger mechanism being used?
The original word here was just triggered by.
So because like I think it's to figure out if it's like dependency or is it like only the trigger event, because needs kind of implies that this is dependency, and it also implies that you have some ability to consume variables, you have some ability to consume maybe artifacts from this another project that would allow you to use that in the subsequent stages or jobs of that project.
It's just triggered by.
So it's not really needs. It's more like the trigger by, I guess, because
this went through I think a dozen different names, but
because needs kind of implies that it's way more than like only simple event system. You want to pass some data across these different pipelines. So those trigger by allow you to pass some details about who triggered you or like how triggered you.
I mean, I think it would help to have a link back. Again, I sort of go to like the simplest version of this is just like a pub sub thing.
I think that's exactly the word. Because what we are trying to build here is a publish subscription with some sort of third party, because we want to decouple the two things. So we have possibly no permissions into setting the dependency on the upstream, and that's why we want to subscribe to a pipeline. So I think probably subscribe or something in the line of that. In a way, I think it makes sense.
I just wanted to comment on the dependency versus a simple trigger. So we built the triggers feature, and the first proposal, like the very first thing that we received from users, I mean the feedback that we received from users, is that they need a way to pass variables there. So it's not only a simple trigger, it becomes a dependency because the downstream pipeline now depends on the variables being passed from the upstream. So it's not really
different. I mean, this is, if you want it to work that way, you would, if you want to pass things from the source, then you should trigger from the source. If you're trying to pull things out of somebody else's pipeline, I don't know what you're doing there.
So I guess it really depends on how you look at the problem, because I think it can be modeled in multiple ways. And like PubSub, which is like event-based mechanism, is like one of the ways.
Yeah.
But the second case is really looking at the dependencies as like dependencies in a way how you trigger stuff. And basically this is the first syntax, which is like top level, which is basically more like it basically implies that this is event-based system that we have. It's not really PubSub, because like you subscribe to some value on the sub part, but it's more like event-based system.
Yeah.
That like someone else triggers us. Someone else triggers us, and is only one that triggers us. Because like they cannot be like multiple triggers like firing on the same entity. You would always have like only one trigger. So technically, like what we could do there, like we have this CI trigger something, which is like project path that like who the trigger us, and this would be like a way for us to pass this information about the trigger source, because it's still like a trigger. And today, Grzegorz, like we use, I think CI source to be a pipeline. So I guess it would not differ in this syntax. We would still like use CI source pipeline, because it still would be like relation between the two different pipelines that are being triggered, and we will just pass like some general information about like this another pipeline that did fire that.
That makes sense to me.
But there is like another way of looking at that, which is more like dependency oriented way, because this is this is more about like, I think, event trigger system. But we could also look at that, looking at the dependencies. Let's say that like, let me try to model project E to Z, for example. I mean this project E, which is like the deployment to staging. And let's take a look exactly how this would look. Let's say that like our project staging deploys different components, deploys API backend, payment backend, sorry, user API payment. Let's maybe for the simplicity say that like we have backend and the frontend. These are two components that we are depending on, and we want to deploy them. So like one way, another way for looking at that is like more like a dependency-oriented approach. When we say that like this project needs some another project, which is like in our case Time int, and it's like backend, and we also have another project, another job in this context that depends on the Time int, which is frontend. And then like we have in the, let's say that this is stage, let's say B, because this is actually something that is given to us. And we have another another job that is basically like performing deployment to staging. Deploy, and this is actually executing some scripts. This approach looks at like the direct, looking at the dependent projects as a dependency of your project instead of like the triggers mechanism. Because like, let's say that you need some very specific versions of the frontend and backend to be created because they only like that can like work together. So you may say that like, I want to deploy this staging every time when someone else like bumps their dependencies. For example, let's say that I'm gonna bump that on any tag is kind of bad word, maybe branch master. So like if there's gonna be like a new change on the branch master or the new change on the branch master of the front end, we're just gonna deploy the latest version of these of these dependencies, but in a way that like we could, for example, trigger this dependent pipeline as soon as like this backend pipeline starts running, and we would maybe could wait for this dependent pipeline to finish and succeed before like we would start to trigger our staging job. So like then you could take a look at that we are deploying staging, and like we have the access to maybe backend, some information about like all these dependencies in this project. So for example, like we could have like the variables that are implicit, just like commit SHA, and we could, for example, deploy exactly these dependencies as we did run this dependent pipeline. It also means that like we could wait on these dependent pipelines to finish, because like there could be like multiple components currently testing, and we would basically wait for these multiple components to be actually successful with all the dependencies that they depend on. And like then triggering mechanisms could basically work in a way that you have these like a set of the bridge jobs that defines like I depend on this another project, and this bridge job then kind of like leads to this association database that is part of the product and knows exactly, okay, so it's maybe a different way of modeling that, because like the model would be pretty similar to that, but would still like be tracking like the dependencies between like the project A and project B and the triggers on which the project B should be run. And the source triggers that we look in the project A when we would like this project A to trigger the dependency on project B. So this is another way of looking at the dependencies and the upstream downstream.
It's interesting, but it's not what anyone's asking for, as far as I know.
I'm not sure this example, the second example, is whether that's a lot more complicated than the first one. That seems to be defining dependencies from jobs. So we'll trigger, so depending, like whenever we evaluate this develop CI YAML file, we might define different dependencies, but each dependency is triggered by a specific job. And that's a dependency with the pipeline. It's not pipeline to pipeline dependencies, but it's pipeline to pipeline jobs dependencies.
It's more like that the job, for this job to be run, it requires another pipeline in another project to finish. So like you could consider this job to be like someone consuming the result of something that is way bigger than the job itself can present.
But how would it refer to which particular instance that it cares about if it didn't trigger it?
Sorry, can you ask again the question?
Yeah, so how do you define, because there's always pipelines running in different systems, so how do you know which instance of a pipeline in the other project if there's multiple in parallel running? I can see now, Jagorsh, why you said this is the most complicated feature we've ever built in CI, if we do it this way.
Yeah, but I just wanted to mention that all the use cases we talked about, it's actually never the simple trigger mechanisms. It's almost always the dependency-oriented approach. And the simple triggering mechanism seems quite simple, and it's easier to understand how it works, but there are so many hidden queries, so many hidden problems there. And in the end, I believe that's completely useless for most use cases. And what we really need is the dependency-oriented way.
So, maybe like what questions you have? Let's try to get to the questions.
I just don't know anybody who's asking for the dependency-oriented thing.
That's interesting, because I think that actually no one is asking for a simple trigger mechanism, because you always want to pass something from the pipeline you depend on. It's almost in every case, it's some kind of a dependency.
Well, and then I guess the second point would be that this feature is interesting, but also not one of our most important features that we would want to spend this much effort building. It's sort of meant to almost be like a quick win, not re-architect everything kind of feature. The ROI isn't there if it's this big.
I just want to also add that the simple trigger is usually one-to-one relationship, whereas here we have many-to-one.
Subscribing to events doesn't have to be a one-to-one. I don't know why there would be that limitation.
Yeah, because for example, in the line 36, we see CI trigger project path. How do you pass?
Oh, at one pipeline at a time. Yes, that's true. But I think that you could like one project could be subscribed to 3 different.
Yeah, but then you can't
only
consume
one would
more
run.
than one at a time.
Yeah, exactly.
So the questions, like what questions you have? Because I think we should go through the questions.
What do you mean? What questions? Like, I don't have any questions.
About like different approaches, like where like a given approach would fail, or like where it would succeed.
I don't know. I think the impression I get is that we just don't want to do this right now. This is too complicated to consider.
Because like technically on the backend side, it's not that complicated. It's really like thinking about the problem differently, and it's more like different way of like describing exactly how the things are behaving, because we have grid jobs that basically are suitable for having dependency-oriented mechanisms, where trigger system.
It's something that we don't have at all in any form, and it actually does not, like, it's more simple, but the simplicity might be false, or it actually has almost the same set of problems that the dependency-oriented approach, right? But these problems are more hidden and are not visible that easily.
Mm-hmm.
So like there is a set of the problems that is like common. How we like prevent explosion of the pipelines. Like we cannot really like trigger 1 million of the pipelines because one project that finished on the downstream dependency. It's like it's unrealistic in any case. And this is one of the expectations. Like in what cases like the trigger mechanism or dependency-oriented mechanism is working on. Because there has to be some limits somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Can we start by forcing, when we specify the dependency, force the branch that needs to be triggered on? So you can just say, I depend on this project and that's it, but I want to depend on this project when it changes on this branch and it triggers the pipeline on this branch. So
that's a very interesting problem. So let's suppose that we have the top level needs, and we can define there that we depend on the upstream project, or perhaps we need the upstream project, and we want to trigger the downstream pipeline when the pipeline succeeds on mastering the upstream project, right? And we commit that to the GitLab CI YAML. In our downstream project, the project that we are working on has 1,000 branches. The GitLab CI YAML gets propagated to all the 1,000 branches. And this way, do we say that we actually want to trigger a pipeline on all of the 1,000 branches in the downstream pipeline project when the upstream pipeline succeeds? How do we limit, the branches in the downstream project? I'm not sure you understand what I mean.
Yeah, so basically it's the same problem, that like you have this GitLab CI YAML that is then spreading across different forks. How you basically limit in what circumstances it's being run?
I think we kind of discussed earlier when we can evaluate and create a subscription between 2 projects only when a change is submitted to master. So in a way, we only have one instance of the subscription. You can only change,
of course, you mean that
branch, but that will not be evaluated and saved as a subscription. Simply, we just ignore that part. Only when we make that change, we merge the branch into master, we reevaluate that change. So in that case, we'll change the subscription.
Okay, so you mean that the master branch, what we are interested in, is present in the upstream project, right? Or in the downstream project as well? Is that the upstream master, downstream master project relationship, or branch relationship only?
So it's it's a master for the downstream project that triggers the subscription, right? So I'm interested into...
But the subscription is being triggered by the upstream project, right?
No, so The subscription is created by the downstream project when we make a change on master.
Okay, but we are not we are not talking about creating subscription at the moment, but about triggering a pipeline. So,
but anytime the upstream finishes, we can check whether we have a subscription that is created by any downstream projects, and in that case, we fire the subscription.
but on which branch in the downstream project we create a pipeline on?
That has to be specified in the YAML file of the downstream.
Yeah, and how do you do that?
I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, perhaps the most simple way is to use the only except, but then does it look like familiar? Is the needs entry with only except and some additional configuration similar to perhaps a job?
Can we just do master to master at the beginning? Would that be a use case?
But it could not be useful enough. You might have, dependency on development branch, or perhaps that might be.
Secondly, it doesn't solve, for example, the case that like we have GitLab CE and like we have 1,000 forks, because this GitLab CE YAML is gonna propagate to 1,000 forks, and like each of these forks is gonna be considered separately.
Yeah, so that's the problem with the trigger-oriented approach is basically the same. What we are talking right now is the trigger approach. It has all the set of
yeah. Well, like I said at the beginning, I think you were right, Fabio. It needs to be out of the GitLab CI YAML.
I'm
unversioned configuration.
Well, you can put it in the GitLab CI YAML, but then you have to do all kinds of magic things to not process it in.
I think that could be confusing for users, that the user can expect that any changes to that YAML file will be evaluated every time we make any changes, but that might not always be the case. So that can be.
Otherwise, you're putting it in. It seems like you're just putting it in the wrong place and then treating it magically.
But then, if you want to configure the relationship the way that you depend on some of status, perhaps you want to run something when the upstream pipeline failed, because it's the event that is very interesting for you. This way, you can't really use that information in the pipeline. When we create that relationship and define this relationship outside of GitLab CI YAML, we can't consume artifacts, we can consume variables. It's it's not the relationship is not really visible in the CI YAML.
Yeah, but I guess all of these plans seem bad in some way or the other. So maybe the reality is just people need to trigger in one direction, and that's the workaround for now.
So actually, I start to maybe like this UI approach, because maybe it touches very specific, just because you have to explicitly define that, it's not surprises. There is no dependency on upstream project unless you define that. And maybe it's much better for us to define on what you are depending. It could be given branch or given something that it would maybe work like a trigger mechanism that we have today, but more for the another project that would maybe inject some set of the variables. So we would have, for example, a little a pipeline schedule, but more like a pipeline project dependency for the pipelines, where you define, I depend on this project, on the changes on this branch, and I inject these CI variables into my pipeline. It's not part of the configuration, but maybe this is the only way to handle the scalability factor. And usually, we assume that people just gonna have 1, 2, 3 these kind of dependencies. So maybe it's just enough, because you're gonna configure them basically on the parent project. I mean, if you use parent fork relationship, but it's still gonna be fine. It's not gonna propagate to forks. But if someone would like to propagate it to forks, they can configure that. But usually you don't need these downstream, upstream dependencies. I mean, downstream triggering on the forks. Why you would need that? If you need that, you still can configure that in your fork if you really want to. So maybe Fabio, your proposal, with just going UI-based approach is basically like the most scalable and the simplest to have.
Do you guys know how Jenkins does it? I know that this feature is actually available in the Jenkins already, but I have no idea how they did it.
In the old version, they used that through UI. You basically defined like that this project depends on another project, but it was dependency, not trigger, if I remember correctly. So like it was that in a case that you depend on a number of other projects, if I recall that correctly, and you were waiting for another project to finish before you would run your own. So it's not a trigger mechanism. It's not event-based system because like you depend on something finishing before you. So it's more goes into dependency-oriented approach, where you define multiple dependencies, not a single dependency.
I think the dependency approach is a lot nicer for maintainability of projects because the project knows what depends on and not the upstream pipeline. It doesn't know where even a library is being used. Like it can't keep count of anywhere where that library is being used. So it makes more sense to define that dependency approach.
Yeah, that's why people are asking for this feature.
Sorry, Jason, can you repeat again?
I just said that's why people are asking for this feature. You can already you can do it the other way already today.
Yeah, so one additional idea is that basically you can solve the scalability problems with only except the same way we are excluding jobs from being run in forks right now, right? We do have some jobs in GitLab CE and E that can only run in the parent project and can't run in the forks. But this should be actually default in that setting, and yeah.
Yes, but like the question is like how we have sensible defaults, because I think what can happen, people might start using the feature without knowing the implications of that, and like we should figure out a way that makes this feature for us to safe to run on the scale, but makes people easy to use. And like whether I think that trigger-based, event-based system is much clearer that like you basically like want your project to be triggered by some other project. It's not really that this project needs some another project. It's basically trigger system. So I don't really like understand why we use needs, because needs preserves like gives a little different
because
information.
We did UX research and people said like they didn't like the way triggered sounded. So that
Yes.
was changed. But I don't think it's necessarily a very good reason why it changed.
So like, but also like if you then look in the context of the direct acyclic graph, it gets into like the direct acyclic graph, because it's not that like you depend on this another project in the event-based system, which needs kind of implies. It's not really true, because like you're gonna have on the job level needs. I need another job to be run before mine, maybe. And this was like one of the proposals for the direct acyclic graph. And then like you have like kind of semantic collision that needs on the top level means completely something different than the needs on the job level for the direct acyclic graph. And I think that the needs, it's very clear for usage of the direct acyclic graph. But it's if you have this name collision, it's really like problematic to understand the why it's like what is the intended use case of this feature. But I lost my thought. What I was talking about. So like about sensible defaults, like it triggered by actually like makes it maybe clear that like you kind of like want your project to be triggered by someone else. And maybe part of that, like we could say it doesn't work on the forks, but it also means that like for the triggered by, we have to replicate a lot of features like only except or the one that rules that we are working on right now, because needs itself doesn't have these like this extension to the syntax. So even in the first iteration, we cannot really like provide sensible defaults, or like we cannot provide like the like configuration for that. When dependency oriented, you already have only accept and rules, but the default configuration of only and accept is like run always, not run in the specific condition, and we cannot really like make if you use the job backend with the needs that needs another project, we cannot have different defaults to the only accept, because then it's like misleading exactly about the behavior of the system. Like, it's different because of the type of the job that you are using. It's inconsistent.
Yeah.
So it's another problem to solve, like how to have sensible defaults that just doesn't kill us.
So yeah, so the idea is that it is a very difficult feature, and that we should start somewhere.
Yeah, and not worth the amount of effort.
All the things we can in the first iteration. So the idea is that in the first iteration of the new pipeline, there is no only accept available there at all. And yeah, I think that was the idea somewhere.
I'm not sure if it can be acceptable if there is no sensible defaults, because this feature is very easy to get out of the control. And I'm very afraid for like system stability and for the hardware for the team and us rushing on disabling this feature and breaking that. So I think that like sensible defaults is kind of like requirement for us to ship this feature.
So what do you propose rewriting this feature to basically make the definition of the relationship in the user interface?
I have no idea, but like I'm thinking that like the sensible defaults, when it's triggered, is one of the key aspects of that feature.
Yeah. So I think we should just cancel what we're doing at the moment and take this out of 12.1 and 12.2. I'll go back to the customers that I know were interested in this feature and see what.
What about the merge request that we have already merged? There's one iteration that is merged at this point. Should we revert that code?
I think so. And
can we finish status attribution? Did we finish status attribution?
Status attribution is a different issue.
But once we merge the merge request that Matthias is currently working on it, and it's like 95% done, there is, you know, some value available for customers.
To do what though? I've never heard a good explanation. Does anybody? If even we don't know what they would do with it, then I don't know.
My laptop just disconnected from the internet for a moment. I think that the use case is that you can basically check inside your pipeline what's the status of the latest pipelines in a few projects that you depend on. I think that we talked about that, and that's a very narrow use case probably, but kind of advocated for finishing this in this way.
I wouldn't leave it as like an undocumented.
Can we, so like, Grzegorz, can you link to the merge request?
Yeah, sure. Let me.
Because my perception is like, if it's almost done, I would refrain of like not shipping that. I would ship that. I would likely mark that as a beta and let people really answer if this is something that is useful for them, and document like different approaches to the upstream downstream dependencies, because like this problem is like it's very complex to figure out, and this actually it's like very close for us to getting the dependency oriented approach.
But does this have any of the protections for like denying creating denial of service attacks on ourselves? And like probably not, right?
This feature itself doesn't cause like the scalability issue, the one that we would merge. The automatic trigger mechanism, this is something that we cause the scalability issues, but this is not yet done.
So I guess I still don't understand then what this feature that we merged does.
You mean the needs pipeline that we are currently working on with Mattia?
The one we're talking about now, yeah, the one that got merged, or?
Yeah, so that was originally proposed to be just, you know, the intermediate step towards implementing the dependency-oriented approach. And at this moment, it just mirrors the status of the latest upstream pipeline whenever we running downstream pipeline, right? So
So you can make a job that has the status of some other pipeline?
Yeah, so it's when you start running a bridge job, we are looking for the latest pipeline in the upstream project, and we mirror the status of the latest pipeline on a given branch.
To a job?
Yeah, to the bridge job.
And so what would be the thing that somebody does with that?
For example,
yes, please, Grzegorz.
So I think that the most simple use case is to basically check if the project that you are depending on some specific branch, has a successful pipeline. Perhaps it's a deployment pipeline or something like that. That's
and the currently running one or the last one that finished?
The last one, doesn't necessarily need to be finished. It can be running.
What if there's more than one running?
Then there's also the last one, the most recent one.
The most recently started of the ones that are running?
Yes.
So basically, like, this approach was really like a stopgap for more like dependency oriented, because technically, like, this would allow us, if we trigger downstream projects, it would allow us to hook to currently running. But there is like a usage pattern for that. Like, if we hook not to the latest running, but to latest successful, we could basically like pass artifacts and the details about the latest successful in very like stable manner. So like time in backend and like latest, I don't know, success, for example. And then you get all these details in your another job. So you know exactly for what dependencies your pipeline is running. So you can, for example, fetch artifacts, you can get commit SHA, and you can build your project for these conditions. So today you would basically have to do some curve fitting to gather some data, but this actually like latest successful dependency on the like latest successful opens you an ability to have these information post back to your downstream project.
Yeah, and that's a very reasonable use case in my opinion.
Because
so
like,
who would do that and why?
Us, for example, you have Omnibus GitLab, and you depend on the latest master. Like you get the status from the latest master from the GitLab CE or maybe GitLab EE, and you build your project Omnibus GitLab for exactly this version of the commit SHA. It shows you as part of the pipeline what you were actually like depending on. It models dependency on another project, because this dependency now is very hidden into like the script that you're running. It's not visible to like in the system, because we don't have
whatever one happened to be running, not.
That was the first iteration. Like, let's hook to latest, but the next iteration would be let's hook to the latest success.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, like, if we release this feature and make a blog post about it, like, what are we saying that you can do now?
Perhaps we can change the feature we are building right now, which is a very simple task, to depend on the latest successful pipeline. Perhaps it would be, something more useful than depending, like mirroring status of the latest, most recent pipeline.
So, and what would somebody be getting? You would just be getting like, what is the?
Like the deployment, right? You collect all the microservices you have, and
I get the Omnibus example, but so for Omnibus, like, what would the Omnibus pipeline be fetching from variables from the last successful pipeline from GitLab CE?
Perhaps SHAs.
In order to
build the package for the given pipeline. Sorry, for the given GitLab CE. Because when you have, for example, pipeline ID, when you have a SHA, you kind of have like, it's completely detached model then on another project if you trigger that. And if you pass these variables, then you can post back the status to maybe the original merge request by going through the pipeline ID and post information. Hey, I built this package for you, and there could be a lot of customers of this package, and like you could post that for whatever you want to.
Mm. Not sure. That's something we do today? I've never heard of anything like that.
Okay, what is the conclusion of this meeting? Because like we discussed different options. I'm not sure like what are the next steps.
Yeah, so I think what we need to do is go back to the customers and figure out something that solves the problems that they're having. Or like try and restate the problems that they're having in a way that's more feasibly buildable in the product. That's where I would start. I think both of the models that we're talking about are not that great. Neither subscribing is that great, and turning this into the most complex feature we've ever built is also not great. We have to find like a different path forward that somehow meets the requirements, I think. And I know the key customers to reach out to who are pushing for this one. I'll probably include one of you because this team seems to run into like kind of architectural decisions about what might work rather than just kind of like talking about the problem to solve.
Can you describe the customer's use case? Perhaps they can use something different, or perhaps we are not thinking about the use case.
Yeah, well, the way it was described to me was just the kind of like the very simple version. They have, so the customer has a really big enterprise and they have teams producing these like shared libraries. Those teams that are producing the shared libraries don't want to maintain the list of projects that are dependent on them. They want those teams to be able to subscribe.
And
so
what they want to do when the new version of a library is released.
Just trigger the pipeline whenever that pipeline is finished.
And what does the downstream pipeline need to do?
That I don't know.
That's the most important answer, probably, because if they want to rebuild, that's something different. If they want to deploy, that might be something different.
Yep, we can find that out.
I don't know, it clearly seems to me like that this is dependency oriented. You just depend on some set of the libraries, whatever you name it.
Yeah, it's definitely not the simple trigger approach.
It could be modeled by the triggered. Everything could be modeled by the triggered. But the question is like, doesn't limit us later? Because like with the triggers, we're not gonna be able to pass artifacts. We're not gonna be able to pass additional informations.
And because status easily.
And like triggered could be like a solution, but is it really like containing us later on more like bigger use cases? And I'm worried about that, like the triggered mechanism.
Yeah.
But this is actually like limiting us in the possibilities how this feature could be used.
Yeah, I'm not saying we should use a bigger version. Both of them seem to not be that great.
But because it seems that with the triggered mechanism, we lost actual information about dependencies because we don't know if this is actual dependency or not. It's more like we are watching for someone else's repo, where if we make this like that first class information, the dependency, it kind of opens a way more information, like a way more cases, I think.
I think that the problem, both problems of the trigger and the trigger by, like the dependencies, could possibly be solved. Again, I'm not sure about the details of the implementation, but could be solved by using the subscription approach on both cases. Because in one case will be if we want to do trigger, is like the upstream that creates a subscription for a downstream, like on its behalf. The other way around is like I actually subscribe to an upstream. The downstream project subscribe to an upstream. So I think in terms of how we want this relationship to be, it could possibly be this using the approach of the subscription. But then the difference is like, okay, in the trigger by is like the relationship has been created by the upstream. In the other one, is the relationship being created by the downstream, and that can be can actually trigger different behavior. For example, the trigger, we can pass in all the variables and all the information to the downstream pipeline because we actually own the project of the upstream and the downstream. That's I think is a key difference.
I'm not sure if I understand. Perhaps we are thinking about different things, but for me, both approaches we discussed today, the trigger by approach and dependency, are both publish subscribe.
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
So the underlying architecture about the automation is basically the same. It's like different way to express what you want to do, and it's like the way that you express what you want to do defines like the future extensibility of the feature and like potential use cases. And this is basically like the biggest problem to solve, because whatever we choose the approach, the underlying problems of the scalability, they stay the same. But like how this feature is useful and how we can solve the scalability issues also like is slightly modified by the syntax and the way how you express.
I propose that we perhaps should create an issue about next steps with trigger by, needs, dependency, however we call it, because we probably need to document our findings somewhere, and we need to look people like Mattia in and Brandon perhaps as well, and decide whether we should just revert what we have already done. It's just a one merge request, not that big. I think we can easily revert that. Or should we actually merge the one Matthias currently working on?
I'm not opposed to merging it, but if we're going to talk about it and document it, we need to be able to explain in some reasonable way like what problem it's solving, and maybe changing it to be able to access the last pipeline status it helps in some way. But even then, I'm scratching my head a little bit. Who would, if you put like, what would the section of the documentation be like? Here's how you can solve problems related to, I don't know,
creating a deployment pipeline in a separate project. So in
order to get variables from the other one,
to get versions. I think that the core component that you would pass in that story is the SHA of latest successful pipeline in all the dependencies you have. The one question is when you actually want to deploy, because this mechanism does not allow you to deploy continuously. Perhaps you would need to actually create a pipeline schedule to deploy periodically, which is not, very like mainstream approach to continuous deployment.
Yeah, so maybe that's what it is then, like how to access the SHA from the last successful. But then wouldn't you just use the API for that, like to fetch specific info about a...
Yeah, you could use just API to fetch latest successful pipeline for the projects you have. It would be basically the same.
Yes, like you can do all of that, but the question is like the way how you attribute that into interface is basically very deep hidden, this information what you did fetch.
Yeah, well, so the other thing that's maybe relevant is we have that other issue, that status attribution for pipelines, so that you can have a behavior based on a trigger. If this is the same code, then it can stay there. I don't know if that's the case or not.
I don't know. I prefer to create an issue and discuss that asynchronously from this point on. It's easier to think about possibilities or what we can do asynchronously than during
Yeah,
a
sure,
call.
that's totally fair.
You have more time to think about it.
Yep, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that works. I'm going to set up a meeting with a couple customers to talk about this particular issue and what the real requirements are, and if there's a way to solve it without even kind of touching on the scalability issues or without having to build complex features or build a new event subscription model, like avoid all of that stuff. We got lots of other stuff to build as well, other than spending months on this thing. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll upload the recording to Unfiltered so Mattia can watch it later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.